out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to CN Live, Episode 7. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
Australia is plagued by scandals involving police raids on journalists' homes and offices, as well as the prosecution of whistleblowers for revealing Australian spying on a former president of East Timor. We'll be hearing a talk by Australian journalist Quentin Dempster, as well as a message to Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison from Julian Assange's father.
Welcome to Politics in the Pub. All of us who hopefully watched Four Corners on Monday evening about Bernard Calarian witness K and the well-practiced deceit of the Australian government. Now, this evening is also highly related to what we discussed in that dramatic meeting 3 weeks ago concerning our responsibility to bring Julian Assange home. And before I introduce Quentin, I want to ask John Shipton, Julian's father, to come forward and read a letter that I gather was recently written to the Prime Minister. John.
Julian's brother, Gabriel, went to Belmarsh prison just a few weeks ago, and this is the letter as a result of that he wrote to Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He goes, Dear the Honourable Scott Morrison, on Tuesday the 6th of August, I went to visit my brother Julian in Belmarsh prison. It's been a year since I'd seen him last. I hugged him and said it was good to see him. He replied it was good to see me too, and that this place is hell. In an instant I understood what he meant. A yellow inmate's band wound tightly around his arm exposed how emaciated he'd become underneath his baggy prison clothes. In his eyes and voice were the signs that this hell was working hardest at crushing any hope he had left. I sat in the visiting room surrounded by the highest security prisoners in Britain and watched my brother eat a sandwich. We didn't laugh this time, there was nothing to laugh about. I held back tears as I realised I might never see him again. I beg you, Prime Minister, to help save my brother Julian Assange's life. Yours sincerely, Gabriel. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Well, as I hinted earlier, the whole issue of the protection of publishers, journalists, whistleblowers is concerns not only Julian, but in particular Julian, but also the topic tonight, which is about police raids on the ABC, the responsibility to protect journalists and whistleblowers, and indeed to support the ABC. When you think of that topic, it wasn't very difficult to decide who to invite to speak to it. Quentin Dempster is a very experienced journalist. He's won Walkley Awards. He's been given the Order of Australia for services to journalism. He's written books about people who stand up to corruption and who suffer the consequences of having the courage to stand up to corruption. In addition to that, Quentin has this rare skill of speaking truth to power and being absolutely explicit in his criticism of bullies and corrupt operators, but somehow in a way that still manages to not completely alienate himself from him. I'm not very good at that, so congratulations in that respect, Quentin. Please welcome Quentin to the microphone.
Thanks, Stuart. Good evening, everyone. I acknowledge we meet on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. Thank God for Annika Smethurst's underwear drawer. That's all I can say. Never in the history of Australia's battered democracy has the secret state and its understandably paranoid intelligence agencies been exposed by the undergarments of a Murdoch reptile. When the AFP subjected Annika to a 7-hour search warrant raid of her Canberra home including rifling through her cookbooks and her underwear drawer, it managed to unite this country's rivalrous media. Well done, AFP. Rupert Murdoch, who once wouldn't hesitate to sool his dirt diggers onto your garbage bins and voicemails to get a bit of commercially exploitable voyeuristic tittle-tattle for his ranting rags, was reportedly affronted by the invasion of Annika's privacy. His News Corp Australasia chairman Michael Miller soon joined with the ABC's new managing director David Anderson and Nine's now all-powerful CEO Hugh Marks to take a brave stand for freedom of the press. Thanks to the AFP for this fortunate timing of their raids, following references from the Australian Signals Directorate in the first Smethurst raid and Australian Security Intelligence Service, ASIS, in the case of the second search warrant raid of the ABC over what's known as the Afghan files. News Corp solidarity can't always be relied upon. Its organs bagged the ABC mercilessly after the ABC and Guardian Australia reported Edward Snowden's drop of NSA Five Eyes intelligence that the ASD had been bugging the mobile telephones of Indonesia's then President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, his wife and senior Indonesian ministers. Picking up the theme, News Corp's then favourite Prime Minister Tony Abbott piled on, accusing the ABC of not playing for Australia. But now, when News Corp's operatives are invaded, we're all in this together. Thank you, Rupert. I'm hoping for an invitation to speak on press freedom at the Paul Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. And now, watch the politicians and the security agencies play the Australian media like a trout. The terms of reference written by Attorney General Christian Porter for the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security are designed to take the heat and steam out of public outrage over the raids and sympathy for Annika Smethurst. Everyone gets to make a submission about their experiences. Terms of reference C, quote, whether any, and if so what, changes could be made to procedures and thresholds for the exercise of those law enforcement powers in relation to journalists and media organisations to better balance the need for press freedom with the need for law enforcement and intelligence agencies to investigate serious offending and obtain intelligence on security threats, close quotes. So the media is being asked to address the concept of contested hearings in relation to search warrants in future. Contested hearing to be called to a court and have this debate about what the security agencies want. So please don't raid us. We'll hand over our USB sticks voluntarily and negotiate with you on what we can and cannot publish. The media is being asked to condone law enforcement and intelligence agencies having access to electronic data on devices used by journalists and media organisations. This is meant to be collaborative and negotiable. Big mistake, I think, if the media falls into that. That's not press freedom. That's a derivative of the old wartime D-notice system where all Australian media editors, including the ABC, agreed not to publish material deemed by the D-notice committee to be vital to national security. There was no statutory requirement. It was, if you like, a gentleman's agreement. In the 1990s, the ABC blotted its D-notice copybook when foreign correspondent reported that we'd wired the new Chinese embassy with listening devices as it was under construction in leafy Canberra. It was a big embarrassment at the time for Australia, the ABC, and for China. The D-notice system was said to be under review, but it hadn't met since 1982. But we're not at war, ladies and gentlemen, now, are we? We're not at war now, are we? Nowhere in the terms of reference of the current parliamentary committee is there a call for submissions on the need for all intelligence and security agencies to embark on a new culture of transparency, to honestly and intelligently engage the people of Australia with their important work. Nowhere in the terms of reference is there a call for submissions for whistleblowers within security and intelligence agencies to be genuinely protected when they have the integrity to formally but internally raise their concerns about criminality, illegality, malfeasance, blundering or incompetence. Some officials believe that when you sign up for employment with a high or low level security clearance, you are contracted to keep the agency's secrets no matter what the blunder or illegality you may have witnessed. Now, Andrew Wilkie said at a forum today that there's protected disclosures legislation. Thank heavens that that is there. That's for public administration, but particularly the protected disclosures don't apply to the employees of security agencies and intelligence agencies. I want you to consider this, I experienced corporate or bureaucratic anger at whistleblowing in the ABC in the 1990s when a brave whistleblower exposed what was called backdoor commercial sponsorship of ABC infotainment programs. He'd used what was in the rules, the upward referral rule, confidentially and internally. This is a concern to my entity. I must raise this matter. Raised it internally and confidentially to draw attention to breaches of the ABC Act and editorial policies which prohibited commercial influence on program content. The viewers, the audience, had to trust the content that the ABC was presenting that wasn't influenced by commercial advantage. But rather than being praised for his integrity, he was vilified, sidelined and moved closer to the exit door. Upward referral was soon rendered to be in practice downwardly destroy those who upwardly refer. Whistleblowers Australia confirms this phenomenon. They've got many people who come to them for legal and moral and empathetic advice. Whistleblowers Australia confirms this phenomenon within Commonwealth, state, public and private sector organisational culture and hierarchy. Many whistleblowers find themselves on the outer immediately they lodge their concerns with their superiors. And soon the whistleblower is counselled, moved out of the workplace, isolated, alienated and then often traumatised to the point of psychological incapacity requiring medical discharge. The whistleblower is out, the problem is covered up. Whistleblowers Australia has identified this as a phenomenon. This is something that the Parliament of anybody of goodwill has to address. How do we get legitimate pathways? If you've got to keep the organisation's secrets, how do we get pathways so that you can raise concerns without destroying your career? And journalists deal with this all the time in dealing with their informants, some of whom are misguided, some of whom don't know the risks, and you have to counsel them and say, look, do you really want to do this? This is the end of your working life. No one will employ you after this. You really want to do this. So you have to be very careful. And this, as far as organisational culture, this has to be addressed about how you protect the people who are at least trying to get the organisation for which they work to act with some integrity and move on evidence that is presented. No wonder most whistleblowers, the ones who are angered or embittered or whatever, go straight to the media or acting just out of conscience and integrity, go straight to the media and take their chances with prosecution. I think that may well be the case in one of those cases that's before the courts at the moment. We need to think again about why whistleblowing is important to competent public and private organisational integrity. Not this rejection of the whistleblower, rather if you're chief executive, say, thanks for raising that with me. Thanks, Stuart, for raising that with me. I'll take it up straight away. Rather than close the door and say, how can we get rid of this bastard? You see, that's...
Lots of people have asked that question.
That is the immediate... Not you, Stuart. I'm sure there'll be no move against you. That's the cultural difficulty in organisational hierarchy. But there's books written about this sort of stuff. So we need to think again about why whistleblowing is important to competent public and private organisational integrity. In terms of national security, it is more important than ever. Just ask Andrew Wilkie, the courageous Australian intelligence analyst who resigned rather than be part of the coalition of the willing's fabricated justification for the invasion of Iraq in 2004, now proved to be a lethal folly, tragically akin to the war in Vietnam. I'm asking all the security agency people who think about this to think about the advice that they give to government. I'll go on to that a little more shortly. To drive home the point about transparency, I need here to repeat the deathbed confession of Robert McNamara, the US Secretary of Defence, who Time magazine asserted had delivered one of the 10 greatest apologies of all time. We were wrong terribly wrong on Vietnam, said Robert McNamara. We owe it to future generations to explain why. There's a wonderful documentary called The Fog of War. This is a wonderful explication of mindsets in intelligence agencies and national security motivations for lethal events. McNamara, writing in his 1995 memoir in retrospect on the management of the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration used its plumbers, the Dirty Tricks Squad, to raid the psychiatrist's office of analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who'd given the Pentagon Papers, which proved the folly of Vietnam, to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Ladies and gentlemen, secrecy, it can mislead the polity. Secrecy, it can kill our young soldiers, sailors. Secrecy can kill our young soldiers, sailors and airmen and women and countless other innocent people. Secrecy is the problem. Now, in 2019, it seems we've learnt nothing from the apology of Robert McNamara or the persecution of Daniel Ellsberg, and contemporaneously, the persecution of WikiLeaks' Julian Assange, the NSA's Edward Snowden, or the attempted discrediting of Australia's Andrew Wilkie, the prosecution of ASIS's Witness K and Bernard Collaery, the ATO whistleblower Richard Boyle, or the Australian Defence Force's Afghan files whistleblower David McBride. In this era of lone wolf and copycat terror, of warmongering and sabre-rattling, as the United States builds up fear of a Chinese invasion, and not just from full fee-paying students at our universities, where the defence analyst Hugh White says Australia must consider having submarines equipped with missiles with nuclear warheads to protect ourselves from China, we need to pause and think again about what we are doing and why. I'm just asking, how much do nuclear warheads cost? Don't we need to mitigate climate change first? Just asking. Can we make nuclear warheads in South Australia? Or do we have to import them from the United States? Wouldn't the possession of nuclear weapons make Australia a certified target for nuclear attack? Won't diversion of taxpayer funds to our nuclear capability mean much less for education, health and infrastructure for our congested cities? Big question I want you to consider. And it's something that all journalists, and I'm sure everybody in the world is looking at now with the struggle of the people of Hong Kong. Will China's President Xi Jinping order the People's Liberation Army into Hong Kong to crush the pro-democracy protest movement? Or will he leave it to the locals to root out the dissident leaders over time, and or just wait patiently until one country, two systems expires in 2047? Somebody said he's moved in today?
Overnight, with tanks.
The army has moved into Hong Kong, you say? What's the source for that? Sorry?
Oh, it's Alice's wisdom, I think.
We'll see what happens.
That's what Trump said.
China may not have a free press. China does not have a free press. But we here in Australia need to demonstrate to the Chinese Communist Party Politburo that we can handle the truth through the clash of ideas facilitated by a free press, robust and transparent public and corporate governance, what we call in a functioning democracy, the separation of powers, an independent judiciary, fair electoral boundaries and an accountable executive government through our representative parliaments. In this era of President Donald Trump's Twitter brinkmanship with North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Iran's President Hassan Rouhani, and Australia's usual symbolic support for the US with our frigate deployed in the Straits of Hormuz, we need smarter, more competent intelligence agencies capable now of building trust with Australian taxpayers. We need intellectually honest engagement with the public, not the criminalising of journalists and the persecution of whistleblowers and media informants. The US pursuit of Australian citizen Julian Assange, now facing UK Boris Johnson-supported extradition and incarceration for life in a US prison. The 2013 courageous action of NSA contractor Edward Snowden in alerting the world to NSA breaches of the US Constitution through illegal mass surveillance has actually deepened the paranoia of security and intelligence agencies. It hasn't changed their thinking to one of engagement with people they say they are trying to defend and protect. Apparently, it's a big deal for them to be able to show the world, particularly their foreign intelligence agency rivals trying to hack into our systems, that they have the determination to keep their own secrets. This is madness. When I mentioned earlier the understandable paranoia of our Home Affairs, security and intelligence agencies, I was trying to keep in fair perspective the heavy burden on them to keep us safe, given the global fear now being escalated by constituent politicians, along with the xenophobia and nationalism being provoked by trade wars and dog whistle racism by constituent politicians, going on all over the world. With random and copycat terror, where and when someone can drive a ute into a crowded street with a white supremacist Christchurch shooter unobserved, unidentified by security agencies, can arm himself with semi-automatic rifles and massacre worshippers in that city's mosque, there is an impossible pressure on our domestic security and counter-terrorism agencies. There's not a hope that they can keep us safe under these totally random circumstances. I'd simply hate to be Duncan Lewis, and I asked you to think about this, I'd simply hate to be Duncan Lewis, head of ASIO. Why didn't he and ASIO know about the threats from these people? That's what the politician, the Prime Minister said, Duncan, why didn't we know about this? What's our security? He has to give an explanation to the ministers who are elected, as ScoMo says, and are accountable to the people. Duncan Lewis and all these security agencies have to front up. The AFP have to front up. Where's our counter-terrorism? Why didn't we know about this guy? If I was Duncan Lewis, I want you to understand this. If I was Duncan Lewis, I'd want real-time access to everyone's mobile phones and browsing history to act immediately on any tip-off. You'd want that, wouldn't you? How can individual privacy be a barrier to public safety, he would ask. And they do ask that. No wonder our politicians have agreed to demands by security agencies for more than 70 security laws, including instantaneous, warrantless access to metadata, telephony and everyone's digital footprint. No wonder that's been waved through by the Parliament, given the fear that exists in our community. No wonder we're now developing interoperability in facial and vehicle recognition technology with CCTV monitoring of the streets and byways of Australia. How can the luxury of individual privacy be a barrier to public safety? We have to answer that question. We can understand the pressure the era of terror, xenophobia and fear imposes on all our law enforcement and security guardians. But for that very reason, these same agencies need to be much more transparent about what they're doing and why. They want us to phone a 1-800 number if we reasonably suspect anyone of malign intent. The public will help keep us safe. If you engage the public will help, is my experience. But to build trust, we need more exposure and debate about the laws which are supposed to govern their operations and the reasons that our privacy can be so easily taken away, but with measures in place to safeguard it. Now, next week, our old mate Brian Toohey will publish his next book, Secret, The Making of Australia's Security State, Melbourne University Press. I think it was one of Louise Adler's last commissions, and Brian's been working on it for years. I've been reading an embargoed copy and will honour that embargo by not revealing its fresh insights and exposures of the full panoply of security and intelligence misjudgments, blunders and incompetence over the post-World War I and World War II period. 360 pages, I think. But as you'd expect, with full footnotes and references, but as you'd expect, Brian lays it all out. He despairs about the unhealthy paranoia which drives the secret state, with the US, China, Russia, the UK, France, India, Pakistan and Israel and others armed to the teeth with nuclear missiles with an ever-present risk of error, escalation or misjudgment. It's a great book, particularly from an Australian perspective. Can you water, please, Stuart? It's a great book, particularly from an Australian perspective. I hope it helps Andrew Hastie and members of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Security and Intelligence think much more seriously and deeply about press freedom and the need for transparency in exactly what the security and intelligence agencies are doing to keep us safe. Finally, I also draw your attention to Bernard Collaery's portentous remark at the end of Steve Kinane and Peter Cronau's ABC Four Corners report on Monday night about the Timor-Leste raids on that Cabinet office in Dili. Remember? What does Mr. Collaery mean when he says that when all this unpleasantness, his prosecution, is over, he will have something more to say, and that there's a boomerang phenomenon developing in this distressing and vicious overreach by the Commonwealth Government? Well, one indicator could be contained in what Professor Clinton Fernandes wrote in Crikey.com on Wednesday this week. He says Four Corners left out another important aspect. He's going on, what was left on the cutting room floor. The use of ASIS for commercial purposes was just one element of a much larger use of state assets for corporate wealth. I'm quoting here, from 1970 onwards, what is now the government agency Geoscience Australia conducted scientific surveys of Australia's undersea geology and then handed over this publicly funded information to petroleum companies for almost nothing. In 1988, Treasury, with the support of the Department of Finance, objected to such valuable information being given away to private interests, urging a much more substantial level of cost recovery. But the Department of Foreign Affairs insisted the national interest required taxpayers fund the costs and, crucially, the risks of investment in fundamental research, while the corporate sector benefited from the energy riches in the continental shelf. Still quoting, on September 4, 1984, West Australian Premier Brian Burke formally opened the $27 billion North West Shelf gas project, which was operated by a then little-known company called Woodside Petroleum. It began exporting liquefied natural gas, LNG, in 1989. The project has today become one of the largest LNG producers in the world, and Woodside has become Australia's largest standalone oil and gas company and one of the top 20 stocks in the ASX by market capitalisation. The Australian government has seemingly deployed the full weight, this is according to Professor Fernandes, deployed the full weight of its diplomatic, legal and scientific assets over decades to secure massive benefits for Woodside's shareholders. In return, according to Woodside's own calculations, in February 2017, governments have received approximately $26 billion in royalties, excise and taxes from the North West Shelf projects since it began in 1984. Other governments have taken a different approach, he says. The Norwegian government is the largest shareholder in Statoil, its state oil company. Statoil's workers elect several of the company's directors, and its shareholders' meetings are open to the public, as are its financial statements. The Norwegian government created the Oljefondet, or oil fund, in 1990 to invest Norway's oil reserve revenue. The fund had US $1 trillion, more than 1.2 trillion Australian dollars in December 2017. In Australia, he says, the national interest has instead amounted to the socialisation of costs and risks and the privatisation of profits, with taxpayers getting a trickle of revenue in return. Now, Quentin Fernandes is a Professor of International and Political Studies at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, and author of Island off the Coast of Asia, Instruments of Statecraft in Australian Foreign Policy. I haven't got that book yet, but I'm going to get it. Now, that's a very serious allegation from Professor Fernandes. If this is true, the Australian public are being robbed.
100%.
Our intelligence, security, and more disturbingly, our intelligence, security, and government agencies, he alleges, are being misused for shareholder benefit, not public benefit. Maybe that's what Bernard Collaery means when he says this will boomerang on the government. I think we need another Four Corners investigation into this allegation, particularly when the bugging of the Timor-Leste embassy is a clear evidentiary lead into what looks like a more systemic problem. This is to be a test of the media's resolve to expose the truth, the Federal Parliament's obligation to call executive government to account, if necessary, including the security agencies, that may point again to the need for another judicial inquiry or royal commission. penultimately, before we go to war with China, in answer to an executive order from Xi Jinping to withdraw all Chinese students from our universities, I want to share Robert McNamara's 11 lessons from the folly of Australia, US and New Zealand's involvement in the war in Vietnam. Well over 1 million North and South Vietnamese Cambodians were killed, 58,000 US military personnel and support staff were killed, more than 500 Australians and New Zealanders and other foreign nationals were killed. A tragedy, a folly, a monumental misjudgment over what is called national security. Please also apply this line of thinking to any of our current suspected or perceived enemies. This is Robert McNamara's In Retrospect, taken from his book In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. Lesson 1, we misjudged them, and we have since, the geopolitical intentions of our adversaries, and we exaggerated the dangers to the United States of their actions. We viewed the people and leaders of Vietnam in terms of our own experience. We totally misjudged the political forces within the country. We underestimated the power of nationalism to motivate the people to fight and die for beliefs and values. Our misjudgments of friend and foe alike reflected our profound ignorance of the history, culture and politics of the people in the area and the personalities and habits of their leaders. We failed then and have since to recognise the limitations of modern high-technology military equipment, forces and doctrine. We failed as well to adapt our military tactics to the task of winning the hearts and minds of people from a totally different culture. We failed to draw Congress and the American people into a full and frank discussion and debate of the pros and cons of a large-scale military involvement before we initiated the action. After the action got underway and unanticipated events forced us off our planned course, we did not fully explain what was happening and why we were doing what we did. We did not recognise that neither our people nor our leaders are omniscient. Our judgment of what is in another people or country's best interest should be put to the test of open discussion in international forums. We do not have the God-given right to shape every nation in our image or as we choose. We did not hold to the principle that US military action should be carried out only in conjunction with multinational forces, supported fully and not merely cosmetically by the international community. We fail to recognise that in international affairs, as in other aspects of life, there may be problems for which there are no immediate solutions. At times, we may have to live with an imperfect, untidy world. Underlying many of these errors lay our failure to organise the top echelons of the executive branch to deal effectively with the extraordinarily complex range of political and military issues. Thank you, Robert McNamara. Anyone but an ignorant redneck would weep as they read these tragic lessons from the folly of Vietnam. I'm hoping for a similar confession, apology and lessons learned from George Bush, Tony Blair and John Howard for the folly of Iraq. And finally, when it comes to a free press and journalism operating within a functioning democracy where the rule of law applied by an independent judiciary hopefully still applies, I draw your attention to US District Court Judge Murray Gerfein, who rejected the Nixon administration's request for an injunction restraining the New York Times from the publication of Daniel Ellsberg's leaked Pentagon papers. Judge Gerfein's ruling was later confirmed by a majority on the US Supreme Court. Judge Gerfein wrote, "The security of the nation is not at the ramparts alone. Security also lies in the value of our free institutions. A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know." And to Annika Smethurst, thanks for enduring the official violation of your underwear drawer.
We're back now live at CN Live after that extraordinary speech by Quentin Dempster that he gave in Sydney the other night. He really encapsulated, I think, what the role of the whistleblower is. And what is that role? Is to tell us in real time what McNamara didn't tell us until his deathbed. It's extraordinary how these guys, when they leave office or when they're about to die, tell everyone that they mistook the internal political situation in Vietnam, their geostrategic interests, and their culture. And we don't have the United States, the God-given right to shape other cultures. Nothing has been learned from that, and we've had no shortage of whistleblowers since Ellsberg, who tried to let the American people know that the United States had gotten Vietnam wrong, because McNamara knew at the time they'd gotten it wrong. That was what the Pentagon Papers was all about. It was a study, a multi-year study going all the way back to the French involvement in Vietnam. And it concluded that US was losing this war. It didn't understand the culture, didn't understand the politics. It was a disaster. McNamara knew it then. They continued to lie, where more and more people died, Vietnamese and Americans and others, as Quentin just pointed out. And this whistleblower Ellsberg was pursued, and only by luck, his case collapsed. But now Julian Assange, who has, through the whistleblower Chelsea Manning, published material that let us know what the United States was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, what other governments have been up to in their corruption, is languishing in a jail. And the US wants him extradited here under the Espionage Act. This is where we're at. Nothing has been learned since those days. Clearly, I don't have a lot of hope that it will be. I want to bring in Peter B. Collins, who's joining us from the San Francisco area. Peter, welcome to CN Live for your first appearance. I just want to know just off the bat what some of your impressions were of this talk.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's great to be with you, and I'm very pleased to observe the work that you and Elizabeth are doing here with the live webcast every week. I had a couple of reactions. I mean, Quentin Dempster is a very interesting man. I enjoyed his jokes at the expense of Keith Rupert Murdoch, Sir Rupert Murdoch. But the references to Vietnam and to McNamara in particular strike me very fresh. I want to recommend to people who may not have seen it the Errol Morris film, Fog of War, where he kind of warmed McNamara up for the deathbed confession. He didn't quite get it out of him, but in a kind of unusual interview box that he put McNamara into, he did force him to confront a lot of realities and contradictions about Vietnam. And I also just want to echo your comment about the treatment of leakers and whistleblowers. Kevin Gosztola had a very good analysis today of the Inspector General's alleged rebuke of James Comey. Now, Comey, of course, caused the release of the memos that he wrote to file of his meetings with Trump. And it led to the sequence of events that caused Rod Rosenstein, who had written the memo to terminate James Comey as FBI director, to turn around and name Robert Mueller, the former Republican FBI director, to conduct the limited hangout investigation. And when we compare, as Gosztola did in a great, well-written piece today, the treatment of Manning, of Snowden, of Kiriakou, and I'm glad John was on with you earlier, of Sterling, and more recently, Reality Winner, and you compare that to the slap on the wrist. I mean, David Petraeus paid the biggest price. He had to resign as CIA director, but there was no consequence. Even that guy Sandy Berger, you know, who snuck out documents after the Clinton administration in his pants leg, got a little more of a consequence than most of the official leakers. And this brings us full circle to the crisis in media today, where the whole sorry sortie with the Russiagate scandal led major corporate media outlets to sharply reduce their standards, to accept anonymous leaks and documents that were read to them over the phone, and all kinds of hijinks that delivered a kind of pulp fiction narrative to hungry consumers, particularly those who felt bruised by Hillary Clinton's loss that was a surprise to some. And you know, this is part of the problem we face with dealing with Trump, because the media has wounded itself. It has served up fake news. And so even though he deploys that claim falsely on many occasions, it has enough resonance with people who pay a little attention, with people who get emails from Judicial Watch and know that there is an other side to this story. And to see Comey, let off without even a parking ticket, sets the standard to continue, that we have a double standard. And leakers of principle are sent packing under the Espionage Act, and opportunistic, self-serving leakers are either left unpunished, or they get book deals, and they'll get Comey will pop up on a CNN panel or an MSNBC paid contributor post sooner or later. And so that's another case where the media have compromised themselves by hiring these talking heads who were part of the scandal.
Extraordinary. Peter B. Collins, by the way, is a well-known radio personality in the Bay Area and out in West Coast. I didn't introduce him properly. Thank you for reminding me. I have a parking ticket. So I've gotten worse punishment than Comey. I didn't read the sign properly. Elizabeth, if you want to join in, please. I thought that this was, there was a lot of detail about Australian politics that a lot of American viewers may not understand, but he was referring to two raids that took place. I happen to be in Australia, so I'm pretty familiar with what happened. It was two raids that took place in the same week. One of a Murdoch-owned Sunday Telegraph reporter who was actually working on a story and reported about a bill in the parliament that would make it legal to spy on Australians. And they raided her home and went into her underwear drawer. And Rupert Murdoch got angry about that. So he and ABC 2 days later was raided, and they with the warrant, and they went in and took materials out of the computers of ABC that related to their reporting of potential war crimes committed by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. These are two very serious matters these reporters were working on, one on the bill to allow spying on Australians and the other on potential war crimes. And that is what they have used their resources for, to try to crush free reporting on these issues. It's an extraordinary thing. And meanwhile, they didn't get this Australian guy who went into the mosque in New Zealand, the point that he made. And then they used that as an excuse to want more powers, and the government gives them more powers. And a point I made in a piece I wrote after those two events, Sunday Telegraph reporter and the ABC, was that both of those took place just a few weeks after Assange was arrested. And I wondered, because both of those cases were well over a year old, that they weren't emboldened, the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, to do that when they saw the British police carrying out a publisher physically out of the embassy where he had legal asylum. So it's a dark chapter we're living through right now. And not much more we can do than talk about it, but we can still do that. And that's where we're availing ourselves of that right. Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I want to echo Peter's observation that, that reading of McNamara's deathbed confession by Dempster was just extremely moving. And I think it is so poignant in terms of, what Dempster himself pointed out, which was that it's so, relevant in terms of the Middle Eastern presence of Western powers that are just absolutely long-term, devastating, misguided at best, et cetera, et cetera. But to return back to the point about the events in Australia, I think it's unfortunate that in the US we don't pay more attention to those stories. And I think that we tend to look at the treatment of Assange in the UK and the treatment of Chelsea Manning in the US as kind of the only examples of the state Western powers punishing whistleblowers. And I think that we really do ignore the situation in Australia, which to me seems almost like a canary in the coal mine of the death of press freedoms. And, and listening to Dempster's talk, I felt that he was right on the money. And it was great to see another journalist of integrity stand up and state how important whistleblowing is and the need for integrity in power and in government and in media. But I felt very kind of jaded and cynical about the chances for that to actually be enacted by, in any real sense. So that was generally my takeaway.
And I would add that, Elizabeth, you're right, that most Americans, think that something that happens in Australia is not significant to them. And I want to commend you and Joe for covering what used to be called foreign news, but international stories, because we need to know about what's going on in Brazil. And Pepe Escobar is a remarkable guy. I love him like a brother, but his coverage and incisive analysis, and also his hip references to American pop culture make his coverage irresistible. But, you can't get that in most American media outlets. And to bring the issue closer to home, I'd like to take a minute here to reference a scandal that occurred here in San Francisco just over the past few months. An independent journalist named Brian Carmody came into possession of a police report. The police report related to the unexplained death of our local public defender. His name was Jeff Adachi, and he died under circumstances that the family finds regrettable. And that is that he had spent the day with a female companion who was not his wife, and he had a heart attack in a borrowed condominium. And this created a lot of curiosity in the public about exactly what had happened. There was, prior to his death, a lot of bad blood between the police department and the public defender for understandable reasons. Jeff Adachi had won many critical cases against the San Francisco Police Department. So when Carmody comes into possession, there's no allegation that he committed a crime to access this police report, but he did what he always does, and he sold it to local TV news departments. The San Francisco Chronicle got its own copy that it says it didn't pay for. Anyway, this embarrassed the police department, and a whole round of finger pointing went on. And initially, it appeared that two judges issued the warrants for this break-in of Carmody's home. They used a battering ram. They handcuffed him as they searched his computers and his paper files. And this was a dramatic violation of California's SHIELD law. Unlike the federal government, we actually have some limited protection for journalists in the state of California. And so the question became, were the judges properly informed that Carmody was a journalist? And they tried to protect the judges. The mayor went off and got off on the wrong foot. Even members of the public defender's office blundered in the initial stages of this emerging scandal. Well, we now know that the judges did know that Brian Carmody is a journalist. His San Francisco Police Department press pass was referenced in the warrant request. And so this stinky scandal goes all the way to our court system. And I cannot believe that it was ignorance or incompetence on the part of these judges, who certainly, to sit on the bench, should know about the SHIELD law. To hear a case like this, they ought to send a clerk to look it up. And so I believe that this is symptomatic of the way the press is being treated on a national scale in this country today, where on the one hand, we have major outlets that are feeding us weak material, narratives that can't be proven, speculative innuendo-based reporting. And on the other hand, we have principled and courageous people who are trying to perform the real role of journalists, and I include Manning and Assange in that list. And the dichotomy is stunning. And the disparate treatment, even by the news outlets that should be standing so firmly for Assange's rights to publish, because it's their same rights to publish. We've been over this before.
The establishment is worried. They're worried about people who are going to expose their crimes, and that's why they're acting the way they are. And can I bring in Catherine Vogan right now, our executive producer? Do you want to join the program, Catherine? Catherine shot that video in Sydney. She's joining us live from Sydney, Australia on Saturday afternoon. Are you there, Catherine?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. In Australia, the pressure on the government seems to be rising to boiling point. You've got the ABC that have come out fighting now. Quentin Dempster was a nightly personality for years on Australian television in the program Lateline, which was news analysis. So what has happened, on the one hand, the producer of the program, the Four Corners program on Witness K, was nervously tweeting the other day that warrants may have been obtained by the AFP to investigate, Australian Federal Police, that is, to investigate the producers of the program. And on the other hand, we have the former president of Timor-Leste, and the story is that Australia spied on Timor-Leste in order to obtain advantage in a trade deal. And Witness K was an intelligence agent who blew the whistle on that. His lawyer was Bernard Collery. And so both of them now, there is an indictment, they're up for prosecution. But what has just recently transpired and what was shown at the end of that program was that Zanana Gusmao, the former president of Timor-Leste, has requested to testify in that case. And he has more or less said that what he will have to say will bring even further embarrassment to the government of Australia. So this is a very, very tense situation. We don't know what's going to happen.
That the Scott Morrison government is the one that is bringing these prosecutions, whereas the previous governments of Australia decided not to. Is that correct? Against the whistleblower?
Correct. And it's a little bit similar to what's happened in America with the Trump administration, where Obama didn't want to proceed with this kind of move because of the threat to press freedom. Now the Morrison government as well has taken that fatal leap.
Yeah. Now, Pete's story of what happened with this journalist who had a police press pass, and then they try to say it wasn't a journalist, and what's happened to Assange, what's happening in Australia, what conclusions can we come to, and above all, what may happen to Assange if he winds up here in Alexandria, Virginia, to go on trial. That whatever press freedoms we had or we pretend to have are eroding before our eyes. And as Peter really aptly points out, what's given out to the public as journalism is pablum and not based on solid evidence much of the time, and it's pushing an agenda. You're also right, Trump calls it fake news. He's really saying it's fake news against him and that they're the enemy of him more than the people, I think. But we're in a huge crisis of journalism, and that's an issue that we're going to continue to cover here on CN Live. Pete, I'll give you the last word.
I want to wrap up with just a quick note of something that surfaced this week and surprised me. Many people are aware that they tried this group called the Proud Boys in New York. They had a street scuffle with some unknown members of Antifa. And so the Manhattan District Attorney used what is referred to as a reverse search warrant. They demanded of Google a list of all of the devices that could be found online in a certain time frame in a geographical area of New York City. And this geofence or geo warrant was issued by a judge. And Google coughed up the information on thousands of devices. And we know that virtually all of those people are completely innocent. There were maybe 6 or a dozen Antifa people, but the dragnet that was set up by this warrant allowed the government to squeeze Google to essentially identify every device that checked in with Google in the time frame and in the geographical area. This is a non-technical copy of the Stingray software that the FBI has rolled out that creates a fake cell phone tower that causes every nearby cell phone to check in with it. It is a similar dragnet that captures the information of thousands of innocent people as they attempt to locate one or more individuals. And I want to credit the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project at the Urban Justice Center in New York and attorney Albert Fox Kahn, C-A-H-N, who exposed this in a piece that he wrote this week. So we have to remain vigilant. The government is using unconstitutional and unethical means. They basically argue that Antifa equals bad. We deserve to know who these actors are, and that any means used will be judged appropriate. And of course, if not, Trump will pardon them. So we have to really, I think, continue to monitor this. And I want to point out that I have not seen this surfaced on Wednesday. I haven't seen any other coverage except the Daily Beast where the column appeared. And likewise, Bernie Sanders' very important critique of journalism and the media with a detailed plan to try to find funding for independent and nonprofit media in the future remains blacked out by the New York Times and the Washington Post 4 days after it was published.
That is more depressing news from Peter B. Collins. So we're going to pass it on out to Kathy Vogan, who will be putting up on the screen the letter that Julian Assange's brother wrote to Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia.
Dear the Honourable Scott Morrison, on Tuesday the 6th of August, I went to visit my brother Julian in Belmarsh prison. It's been a year since I'd seen him last. I hugged him and said it was good to see him. He replied it was good to see me too, and that this place is hell. In an instant I understood what he meant. A yellow inmate's band wound tightly around his arm exposed how emaciated he'd become underneath his baggy prison clothes. In his eyes and voice were the signs that this hell was working hardest at crushing any hope he had left. I sat in the visiting room surrounded by the highest security prisoners in Britain and watched my brother eat a sandwich. We didn't laugh this time, there was nothing to laugh about. I held back tears as I realised I might never see him again. I beg you, Prime Minister, to help save my brother Julian Assange's life. Yours sincerely, Gabriel. Thank you.